My name is Thomas Redwood. I am 41 years old, and I work as a logging supervisor for Pacific Coast Timber Company, managing timber harvesting operations in the old growth and second growth forests of Humboldt County, California. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been working in the logging industry for 18 years, spending the last 12 in the Redwood forests of Northern California, where we conduct selective harvesting under strict environmental guidelines that protect old growth groves, while allowing sustainable timber operations in designated forest areas. This happened last September while supervising a logging crew working in a section of second growth forest about 15 miles east of Yurok, near the boundary between private timberland and Humboldt Redwood State Park. The work involved selective thinning of Douglas fir and redwood trees to improve forest health and reduce fire risk. Our crew was working in an area that had been logged in the 1960s and had regenerated into dense second-growth forest that required thinning to prevent overcrowding and disease. The worksite was accessible by logging roads, but was still remote enough that we were operating several miles from the nearest public roads. I was supervising 5 experienced loggers using chainsaw and cable equipment to fell marked trees and prepare logs for transport to the mill. The crew had been working the site for 3 days and was making good progress on the thinning operation. Around noon on the 4th day, while the crew was taking lunch break near our equipment staging area, one of my loggers approached me with obvious concern about something he'd observed in the forest. Jake Patterson, who'd been working these forests for over 20 years, told me he'd been seeing something large moving through the trees that didn't match any wildlife he knew in the area. Jake described glimpsing something approximately 8 feet tall, moving between the large redwood and Douglas fir trees about 200 yards from our worksite. He said it appeared to be walking upright on 2 legs, but was much larger and more powerfully built than any human. I initially assumed he'd seen a black bear, which are common in Humboldt County forests. But Jake insisted that what he'd observed was clearly bipedal and moving with intelligence and purpose that didn't match bear behavior. He also mentioned that the other crew members had noticed an unusual smell in the forest that morning. A strong, musky odor that didn't correspond to any known animal scent. Around 2 p.m., while we were working on felling a large Douglas fir, the entire crew became aware of something watching us from the forest. The feeling was unmistakable. That prickling sensation of being observed by something hidden just beyond clear sight. I called for a work break and had the crew gather near our equipment while I scanned the surrounding forest with binoculars. About 300 yards away, in an area of particularly large old-growth redwoods that bordered our work site, I could see movement that appeared to be something large positioning itself for better observation of our activities. Through binoculars, I caught glimpses of what appeared to be a massive figure moving between the trees with deliberate stealth. The figure was dark brown or black in color, covered in what looked like coarse hair, and was clearly much larger than any human being. Most remarkable was that the figure seemed to be studying our logging operation with obvious intelligence, moving to different positions to observe our work from various angles while maintaining enough distance to avoid clear identification. Around 3 p.m., while we were using cable equipment to move felled logs, something threw a large branch from the forest toward our work area. The branch landed about 50 feet from our equipment, thrown with enough force to suggest tremendous physical strength. The thrown branch was followed by rock throwing, stones the size of baseballs being hurled from the forest with accuracy that indicated intelligent targeting rather than random animal behavior. The rocks were aimed to land near our equipment without hitting anyone, as if something was trying to get our attention or demonstrate its presence. I made the decision to suspend logging operations for the day and move the crew back to our staging area near the logging road access. As we were loading equipment, several crew members reported seeing the large figure more clearly as it moved through the forest parallel to our route. The figure appeared to be following our movements while maintaining distance, occasionally stopping to observe our activities. Jake Patterson, our most experienced logger, estimated the figure at over 8 feet tall with proportions that suggested massive physical strength adapted to forest travel. When we reached our vehicles and were preparing to leave the site, we discovered large footprints in soft earth near where we'd parked our trucks. The prints were roughly human, shaped but much larger. Approximately 18 inches long and 7 inches wide with clear toe impressions, but no evidence of footwear. The tracks showed that whatever had made them had approached very close to our vehicles, circling the area where we'd parked while examining our equipment and supplies. The depth of the impressions indicated something extremely heavy, much heavier than any human. I documented the footprints with photographs and measurements, then reported the incident to Pacific Coast Timber Company management as a potentially dangerous wildlife encounter that required assessment for worker safety. 3 days later, I was contacted by Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from Idaho State University, who specialized in cryptozoology research and had heard about our encounter through forestry industry contacts. He requested permission to examine the site and interview crew members about what we'd observed. Dr. Meldrum explained that Sasquatch or Bigfoot encounters had been reported in the Humboldt County Redwood forests for over 70 years, with consistent descriptions from loggers, park rangers, and outdoor enthusiasts who spent time in the most remote forest areas. He showed me historical accounts from logging operations dating back to the 1950s, describing encounters with large bipedal creatures that demonstrated intelligence, curiosity about human activities, and physical capabilities that exceeded any known wildlife in the region. Dr. Meldrum also explained that the old-growth and mature second-growth redwood forests provided ideal habitat for large, intelligent primates. Abundant food sources, fresh water, shelter from weather, and minimal human disturbance in vast areas of dense forest. I spoke with Yurok tribal members, whose traditional territory includes the Humboldt County forests, where we work. They describe traditional knowledge about beings they call by words in their language that translate to stick Indians or forest giants, entities that have lived in the redwood forests since ancient times. According to Yurok teachings, these beings are intelligent and generally peaceful but territorial about their forest homes. They occasionally interact with humans who work respectfully in the forest, sometimes observing logging or other activities out of curiosity rather than hostility. The tribal members emphasized that the redwood forests are ancient and sacred places that are home to more than the trees and animals that most people recognize. They advised showing respect for all forest inhabitants and understanding that some residents prefer to remain hidden from human society. I continue working logging operations in Humboldt County because it is important work that provides sustainable timber resources while protecting old-growth forests for future generations. But I am much more aware now that our work sites might be observed by forest inhabitants that aren't officially acknowledged, and I maintain respectful protocols when crew members report unusual encounters or evidence of non-human forest residents. My name is Michael Sawmill. I am 53 years old, and I work as a maintenance supervisor for the Scotia sawmill, one of the last remaining company towns in California, located in Humboldt County, about 20 miles south of Eureka. I've been working at Scotia for 27 years, since I was hired straight out of high school by the Pacific Lumber Company, which operated the mill and owned the entire town until the company was sold and the mill operations were restructured in the early 2000s. Scotia was built in the 1880s as a complete company town designed to house mill workers and their families. At its peak, the town had a population of over 2,000 people, all of whom worked for or depended on the lumber company. The mill operated 24 hours a day, processing old-growth redwood logs into lumber that was shipped worldwide. This happened last November while I was conducting overnight maintenance on Mill Number 2, the older of Scotia's two sawmill buildings, which dates to the 1920s and still contains much of its original equipment, including massive bandsaws, log carriages, and steam-powered machinery. Mill Number 2 had been shut down for major equipment overhaul, giving me access to machinery that normally runs continuously during production shifts. The maintenance work required checking and adjusting equipment that hadn't been idle for more than a few hours in decades. Around 10 p.m., while I was working alone on calibrating a band saw that had been installed in 1934, I began hearing sounds from other parts of the mill that suggested production activities were continuing despite the shutdown. The sounds were unmistakable: log carriages moving, saws running, steam engines operating at full capacity. The sounds were consistent with normal mill operations during a busy night shift. But I knew the mill was completely shut down, and I was the only person authorized to be in the building. All power-to-production equipment had been disconnected, making it impossible for machinery to be operating. I investigated the source of the sounds, moving through the mill building with my flashlight and checking each piece of equipment. Everything was properly shut down and disconnected. But the sounds of production activity continued throughout the building, always seeming to come from areas where I wasn't currently located. Around midnight, while working on a planer that dated to the 1940s, I encountered something that challenged everything I understood about maintaining industrial equipment in an empty building. Moving through the mill were workers dressed in clothing styles from earlier decades, operating machinery and conducting normal production activities. The workers appeared solid and real, not transparent or ghost-like. They were engaged in lumber production work, running saws, moving logs, operating equipment, with the skill and efficiency that came from years of experience. Most remarkably, they seemed to be achieving production levels that exceeded anything the mill had accomplished during my tenure. The workers showed awareness of my presence, but didn't seem surprised or concerned about modern maintenance personnel working in their production area. They continued their activities while occasionally nodding or gesturing in acknowledgement of my work. Around 2 a.m., I observed a complete production shift in operation. Dozens of workers processing logs into finished lumber with coordination and efficiency that suggested decades of working together as a team. The workers represented different eras, with clothing and equipment styles spanning from the 1920s through the 1960s. Most fascinating was that they appeared to be training newer workers, demonstrating proper equipment operation and safety procedures with obvious concern for teaching correct techniques. The training activities suggested that the spirits of experienced mill workers were continuing to pass on their knowledge to subsequent generations. Around 4 a.m., while I was adjusting a log turner that had been installed in 1956, one of the spirit workers approached and seemed to be offering guidance about proper maintenance procedures. Though no verbal communication occurred, the worker demonstrated equipment adjustments that improved the machinery's operation beyond my own technical knowledge. The spirit worker showed me maintenance techniques that weren't documented in current manuals, methods that had been developed through decades of practical experience with the specific equipment. The guidance resulted in better calibration than I'd achieved using standard procedures. As dawn approached, the spirit production activities gradually faded until the mill returned to its normal shutdown condition. But the equipment I'd been working on was operating more efficiently than it had in years, calibrated beyond what should have been possible using available documentation. That morning, I reported completing the scheduled maintenance work, but was careful about describing the unusual assistance I'd received during the night. Mill management is focused on productivity and safety, not supernatural phenomena that might concern workers or insurance companies. 3 weeks later, I was contacted by Barbara Chen, a local historian who specialized in Scotia's company town history, and had heard about unusual experiences reported by mill workers over the years. She requested an interview about what I'd encountered during overnight maintenance. Barbara explained that spirit worker encounters had been reported at Scotia Mill for decades, particularly during overnight maintenance periods, when modern workers were alone with machinery that had been operated by hundreds of workers over nearly a century. She described these encounters as evidence that workers who had dedicated their lives to lumber production maintained some connection to the mill and its equipment, continuing to take pride in efficient operation and proper maintenance of machinery they'd worked with for decades. According to Barbara's research, the spirit workers seemed particularly active when equipment required maintenance or when production problems needed solving. They appeared to modern workers who were struggling with machinery problems, offering guidance based on cumulative knowledge that spanned multiple generations of mill operation. One retired millwright told me that spirit worker assistance was considered normal at Scotia, part of the mill's culture of experienced workers helping newcomers learn proper techniques and safety procedures. He emphasized that the spirit workers were protective of both equipment and personnel. I continue working maintenance at Scotia Mill because it is skilled work that I take pride in, And because maintaining this historic facility connects me to generations of workers who built and operated one of California's most important lumber production facilities. When I encounter evidence of assistance from spirit workers, I approach my work with gratitude for knowledge that spans nearly a century of mill operation and with respect for workers whose expertise continues to benefit modern production. My name is Robert Beacon. I am 47 years old, and I work as a lighthouse maintenance specialist for the U.S. Coast Guard, responsible for maintaining automated navigation equipment at remote lighthouse stations along the California coast from San Francisco to the Oregon border. I've been working lighthouse maintenance for 21 years, spending countless hours alone at isolated lighthouse stations that were once manned by resident keepers, but now operate with automated systems that require periodic inspection and repair by specialized technicians. This happened last March while conducting quarterly maintenance at Point St. George Lighthouse, located on a remote rocky point about 6 miles northwest of Crescent City. The lighthouse was built in 1856 and operated with resident keepers until 1975, when automation made human operators unnecessary. Point St. George is one of the most isolated lighthouse stations on the California coast, accessible only by a rough dirt road that requires four-wheel drive vehicles and takes over an hour to navigate. The lighthouse sits on a dramatic rocky headland surrounded by dangerous waters that have claimed dozens of ships over the past 150 years. I arrived at the station around 3 p.m. to begin maintenance work that would require staying overnight to complete system diagnostics and equipment calibration. The lighthouse keeper's house, built in 1856, is still maintained as emergency housing for Coast Guard personnel working extended maintenance operations. The maintenance work involved testing and calibrating the automated beacon system, inspecting solar panel arrays that power the facility, and conducting safety checks on the lighthouse structure itself. This work requires accessing all levels of the lighthouse tower and spending extended time alone with equipment that operates continuously. Around 8 p.m., while calibrating the beacon rotation timing, I discovered historical records that previous maintenance personnel had left in the lighthouse keeper's quarters. The records documented maintenance activities dating back to the 1960s, but they also included disturbing notes about unusual experiences reported by Coast Guard technicians working alone at the station. Multiple technicians had documented encounters with apparitions of former lighthouse keepers, particularly in the keeper's house and lighthouse tower during overnight maintenance periods. The reports were remarkably consistent across different personnel and different time periods. Most disturbing were references to Keeper Samuel Morrison, who had committed suicide at the lighthouse in 1924 after 3 years of isolation had apparently affected his mental health. According to historical records, Morrison had been found hanging in the lighthouse lantern room, apparently unable to cope with the extreme isolation and responsibility of maintaining the station. Around 10 p.m., while working in the lighthouse lantern room where Morrison had died, I began experiencing psychological effects that made me understand why isolation at Point St. George could drive someone to desperation. The feeling of complete isolation was overwhelming, despite modern communication equipment that connected me to Coast Guard operations centers. The lighthouse sits in an environment that seems designed to test human psychological endurance. Constant fog, endless sound of crashing waves, complete darkness beyond the lighthouse beam, and knowledge that the nearest help is hours away create conditions that challenge mental stability even during brief visits. Around midnight, while conducting equipment tests that required staying in the lantern room for extended periods, I encountered the apparition of Keeper Morrison himself. The figure appeared solid and real, dressed in 1920s lighthouse keeper uniform, conducting normal maintenance activities with obvious familiarity and expertise. Morrison seemed to be trapped in endless repetition of his lighthouse duties, checking equipment, monitoring beacon operation, and maintaining systems with the dedication that had characterized lighthouse keepers who took pride in providing reliable navigation assistance to mariners. Most tragic was that Morrison appeared to be experiencing the same isolation and desperation that had led to his suicide, but was unable to escape the responsibility he felt for lighthouse operation. He was condemned to continue his duties indefinitely, unable to rest despite the fact that modern automation had made his work unnecessary. Around 2 a.m., Morrison's apparition became more agitated, moving through the lighthouse with increasing desperation that suggested he was reliving the psychological crisis that had led to his death. The atmosphere in the lighthouse became oppressive, filled with despair and hopelessness that seemed to emanate from Morrison's trapped spirit. I completed my maintenance work as quickly as possible and left Point St. George before dawn, unwilling to spend additional time in an environment that had driven multiple lighthouse keepers to suicide and continued to trap at least one of them in eternal repetition of duties that had become psychologically unbearable. Dr. Hendricks also mentioned that Point St. George Lighthouse had been the subject of paranormal research due to consistent reports of keeper apparitions from Coast Guard personnel, lighthouse historians, and paranormal investigators who visited the site. I spoke with retired Coast Guard personnel who had worked lighthouse maintenance during the transition from manned to automated operations. Several described encounters with keeper spirits, who continued performing duties they'd been unable to abandon even in death. One retired technician told me that lighthouse keeper spirits were generally benevolent, trying to assist with maintenance work and ensure continued operation of navigation systems they devoted their lives to maintaining. But he emphasized that working alone at isolated lighthouse stations required strong psychological preparation. I continue working lighthouse maintenance along the California coast because it is important work that maintains navigation safety for mariners. But I am much more aware now of the psychological challenges that lighthouse keeping imposed on previous generations of Coast Guard personnel. When I work at isolated stations like Point St. George, I approach the assignments with respect for lighthouse keepers whose dedication to duty exceeded human psychological limits, and with understanding that some of them remain connected to responsibilities they couldn't abandon even in death.